A very warm welcome to all of you. Today's lecture is on circular migration. So, circular migration is something that's come up several times in the course. So, what we'll really do is we'll look at the concept of circular migration, and the lecture is titled Interrogating the Circular in Circular Labour Migration, the Case of Internal Migration in India. So, the idea really is to better understand the concept of circularity in migration, circular migration, that's come up in the course many times, like I said. So, in this lecture, we will see that how circularity is typically used, conceptualized in the international migration literature, and I will take you through how this has changed over time. And then we will move to the internal migration literature. And so very often what you have is, circularity or circular migration is often used along with seasonal migration, short-term migration, and it's not really conceptualized in terms of internal migration. And this is a gap that is there in the literature. And so what I'll do is I'll try and address this through the empirics of circularity. So, for me, the key motivation to do this, the point of entry of this work has been empirical. I've worked on Bihar migration, and from the Bihar surveys, we find that migration is circular, and that men go out to work and then they work outside for long periods of time for many years, and they eventually come back to the village. And so the idea really is that, to have the empirics of migration contribute to the idea, to contribute to the conversation about its conceptualization. So now, like I said, we're going to look at circular migration, we're going to look at the conceptualization and empirics, we're going to look at the interplay between that. And so then I'll take you first to the international migration literature, internal migration literature, as far as the conceptualization is concerned, and then this also overlaps with the migration and development literature, as you will see. And in the empirics specifically, I will take you through some of the results of longitudinal surveys in Bihar, India that I've been involved with, and more specifically take you through family case studies, migrant narratives that help us understand the connections between the village and the city, and then these connections also help us understand why migration remains circular, right? So now the multiplicity of methods is important in a context where research on migration in India is disproportionately based on secondary data sets, right? And so here, and what are these secondary data sets? As you've seen over some lectures, largely the census and the National Sample Survey Organization, the census and the NSSO are two main sources of internal migration in India, are the two main sources of data on internal migration in India. So, while the census is primarily designed to capture the distribution of population, the NSS focuses on labour market attributes. So, therefore, as a result, worker mobility or migration is not a primary area of inquiry for either agency, the NSS or the census, both of which define migration differently. And what we also need to understand is that there is an underlying bias towards long-term migration, towards permanent migration in data collection. And therefore, these agencies, the census and the NSS, then tend to miss out on a significant proportion of short-term migration as well as circular migration. So now we'll talk a little bit about the international migration literature, right? So at the turn of the 20th century, there was a sudden realization that private remittances were really important, and these private remittances actually outweighed international aid and debt flows. So therefore, remittances began to be seen as a new development mantra, and there was a paradigm shift therefore in the understanding of international migration, and the spotlight was then placed on remittances and therefore the circularity of migration. So what you have is, you had a perspective which was there for a long time of brain drain, Now, this brain drain perspective shifted to a triple win perspective in international migration. So, what do we mean by triple win? Triple win is when migration is considered to be beneficial for source regions, for destination regions, and migrants themselves. And then you had a literature which evolved and established that migration mediated by remittances contributed to the development of source regions. And remittances led to increase in income and consumption, that remittances led to a reduction in poverty in source regions, and they lead to improved welfare outcomes such as increased school enrollment, because you also had a large chunk of remittances going into education, to food consumption, and so on and so forth, right? So, while the literature in international migration established the importance of remittances, and remittances were largely mediated by circular migration, right? You also had some spotlight on internal migration, and as we saw, we studied Ravenstein's laws and we studied Lee's push-pull framework, and these were both of these, right? Ravenstein's laws, Lee's push-pull framework, they're both theorizations of internal migration. They're both theorizations of within-country migration. And even in neoclassical models where wage and expected income differential explain rural-urban migration, these two were conceptualizations in internal migration, as was NELM, the new economics of labor migration, where migration was viewed as a household decision. So, NELM actually incorporates remittances, right? And because of its framework of household risks and benefits and so on, NELM incorporates remittances, circular migration, and return migration in its framework, which had been beyond the scope of neoclassical theorization. So, while on the one hand, literatures of internal and international migration are distinct and they don't speak to one another, on the other hand, scholars have argued that there is more convergence than divergence between internal and international migration. And why is that? So, migration scholars have argued that both internal and international migration have similar drivers and outcomes. So, causes of migration tend to be very similar for both internal migration and international migration. And the impacts of migration also are quite similar for both internal and international migration. The fundamental difference, however, between internal and international migration is that of citizenship. So, on the basis of which persons moving from one state to another are not treated equally. Citizenship is a decisive factor defining a person's rights in a country that has traditionally been used to determine who is subject to control when crossing international boundaries. So, ideas from modernization theory embedded in national development projects in the global south are a fundamental part of the internal migration literature, as you have seen in the course. And then you have critical development studies. What critical development studies really does is it questions this, so this whole discourse on migration and development is something which is inherently positive, right? And like we saw, it contributes to a triple win, and we saw the welfare outcomes of remittances and so on. So what critical development studies and critical migration studies does is it really questions this linear positive relationship between migration and development. And at the same time, it focuses on ideas of structural imbalances, structural inequalities. It focuses on adverse incorporation of migrants. There's also an emerging literature in the area of precarity, migrant precarity, that sort of finds its way in the critical development studies literature, which is contrary to the migration and development discourse, which is largely positive. So, And you also then have a complex interplay of structure and agency, and so you have migrant subjectivities which are given importance vis-a-vis the grand narratives of development. So now coming to the debates around conceptualization of circular migration, and the debates are largely skewed towards north-south migration, right? Largely international migration. And so you have the Global Commission on International Migration, and which without elaborating on the concept or definition of circular migration, it asserts that countries in the developing world stand to make more gains from temporary and circular migration of their citizens than from their permanent departure. So the GCIM was established in 2003 to promote global discussion and cooperation on issues related to the international movement of persons. And it had 19 UN member states. It was charged with bringing the issue of migration to the forefront of the global development agenda and analyzing migration regulation, identifying shortcomings, and proposing ways to improve migration. So what the GCIM does is, it urges countries of origin to adopt policies that promote economic growth and development so that people are less inclined to leave, encourage to return, and practice circular migration. And so what it then also, by implication, it recommends that countries of destination enable easy mobility of migrants, and that policies formulated by the states and international organizations maximize the development impact of return and circular migration. So therefore, in other words, it argues that the old paradigm of permanent migrant settlement is progressively giving way to temporary and circular migration. Now, there are several inherent tensions embedded in the semantics of migration, of circular migration, that we discussed, right? So now, as I mentioned, that the debate, now there are certain inherent tensions embedded in the semantics of circular migration that we have discussed. The first is the clubbing of temporary and circular as seemingly indistinct categories, and this is quite conceptually and analytically befuddling. The second point is that the word temporary, by its very meaning, alludes to something that is transient, in the passing, lasting a limited time, or short term, as opposed to something that is permanent and long term. So even though the GCIM does not provide a conceptualization or a definition of circular migration, temporariness is understood to be a key feature of the circular migration that it is describing. Now let us come to the Global Forum for Migration and Development, and this kind of somewhat addresses the tension by incorporating long-term migration, right? So the Global Forum for Migration and Development is a state-led, informal and non-binding process which helps shape the global debate on migration and development. And so you see, so the Global Forum for Migration and Development, it defines circular migration as the fluid movement of people between countries, including temporary or long-term movement, which may be beneficial to all involved if occurring voluntarily and linked to the labor needs of countries of origin and destination. So this shift towards long-termism is echoed in an influential policy brief of the Migration Policy Institute, which notes that circular migration is based on a continuing long-term and fluid relationship among countries that occupy what is now increasingly recognized as a single economic space. And according to the UNECE, circular migration is constitutive of 5 dimensions: repetition of move, which is its frequency, directionality, time, purpose or reason of move, and development impact. So, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe argues that circular migration is constitutive of these 5 dimensions. So, therefore, debates about conceptualization of circular migration have been at the forefront of migration research and policy in the global north. And so, we saw, based on these definitions, it's evident that dimensions of circular migration are complex in interpretation, and the assessment and evaluation and the concept of circular migration, it remains very difficult to operationalize. So, therefore, debates about the conceptualization of circular migration, there is a conceptual dissonance that it's long term yet not circular. These have been at the forefront of migration research and policy in the global north. And now the motivation is that perspectives of nation states and international policy organizations address the twin goals of reducing labor shortages in destination countries and at the same time reducing immigration or permanent migration. So, the policy regime, the policy imperative in the global north is how to address labor shortages on the one hand and simultaneously how to reduce immigration, right. And so, therefore, in this context, circular migration becomes really important. And now to regard circular migration as migration by choice as one of the same things is really fallacious, as for migrants. If you look at migrant perspectives, migrants view this kind of temporary migration as an outcome of restricted visa regimes and barriers to legal settlement in destination countries. So, shift towards long-termism in the conceptualization of circularity is therefore then accompanied by privileging the economic, increasing importance of work and employment as a fundamental reason to migrate in a globalized economy. But then this also implies that not only are non-economic forms of migration not desired, but also that migration for economic reasons of a certain kind, of a certain class, must remain circular and not transition to the earlier paradigm of permanent settlement. So, to some, there are some striking similarities in conceptualizing circularity in internal and international migration. And the whole idea to address labor shortages and yet with a clear agenda of reducing immigration, what nation states do is they legislate circularity, where the production and reproduction of labor is the onus of the source country. And then in a similar vein, this is irrespective of whether it's short term or long term, economic discourses view circular migration as a temporary movement. And it is in this discourse, in this narrative, that we see that, older paradigms of permanent migrant settlement are progressively giving way to temporary and circular migration. Now, having seen this background, of circularity and how it's emerged more recently in international migration, we come to the empirics of circular migration in the context of the global south and also now in the context of internal migration. So, I don't want to expand too much on the literature, but broadly, empirical studies reveal a complexity in migration patterns. They establish the importance of circular migration. So, for Southeast Asia, you have Graham Hugo's work, which is really influential. There's a seminal 1982 paper that he has written on circular migration in Indonesia. Then there's Jonathan Riggs' work, again, which is for several countries in Southeast Asia. For Thailand especially is very well known. In China, you have Cindy Fan and Rachel Murphy's work, and in the case of Africa, you have Deborah Potts and Collinson et al.'s paper, which is very influential. And largely, these papers throw light on the importance of circular migration in internal migration in these countries, right? And so, migration is not largely a one-time act from the village to the city or from the source to the destination region,
but there is a constant connection between the rural and urban area, between the source and destination, and migration is largely circular. Now, there are several methodological issues when we want to study circularity in migration. So, the first is that very often seasonal and circular migration is understood to be the same thing, and which is understood to be distinctly different from long-term migration. But this necessarily need not be the case. You can have migration which is circular and still long-term. And then you have seasonal and circular migration associated with short-term and irregular migration. And then distinguishing between temporary and permanent migration is not always easy. You have a lot of in-between types of mobility. You have semi-permanent migrants, you have middle migrants that have one foot in the city, one foot in the village. So, temporary and permanent are not necessarily binaries, they can also overlap and so on. And then, how is it? So, if a migrant is circular, they have one foot in the source and another foot in the destination area, right? But you also have the concept of being urban. You also have the concept of becoming urban, right? So, Ahn et al. In a very interesting paper, they talk about the degrees of migrancy, right? So, how do you become urban? Through rural urban migration, of course, but you could have degrees of migrancy on the basis of law. What does the law define you to be? Does the law define you to be rural or urban? On the basis of livelihoods, on the basis of identity, identification, social and cultural behaviors, social network associations, all of these then have a role to play in the nature of your migration, in the culmination of your migration to the city, and of course, the circularity of your being. If you have one foot in the city and one foot in the village, how much is it that you're rural, how much is it that you're urban? Is being a city dweller binary? Is being a city dweller and being a rural person, are they mutually exclusive, or can they interact with one another? All of this, all of these issues come up in the empirical literature in circular migration. The other thing which is really interesting is that there's a tendency on part of researchers to assume that household members will know if an individual is a circular migrant or not, right? Now, when people migrate, of course, they have an intention to migrate, they have an intention to have certain kind of migration, but whether they are eventually circular migrants or permanent migrants is not possible for either that person to know or for their household members to know, right? Now, let me take you through some of the empirics of circular migration in India. So, you have Jan Bremen's seminal work on seasonal and temporary circular migration in South Gujarat. And Bremen's work is largely rooted in a Marxist framework, and it pivots towards a structural discourse on circular migration. And so, he's coined the term footloose labor or the footloose proletariat, which is an enormous mass of men and women, adults and children, who possess little or no means of production and lead a circulatory existence at the lowest rungs of the labor system. So, you see, circular migration then is also associated with labor, it's associated with class, where you are in social standing, and it's also associated with caste. And as as in one of the later lectures, we'll see much of the circular migration in a particular sector, for instance, the construction sector in India, is adversely incorporated, and the majority of workers are Dalit and Adivasi workers belonging to the poorest regions of the country. So, Bremen argues that footloose labor is pushed out of the agrarian labor market to depend on casual work, and their urban employment in the informal sector is marked by a cyclicality which is usually associated with the agrarian rural economic lifestyle. So you have, a large part of India is under rain-fed agriculture, where agriculture does not have enough employment to sustain livelihoods and provide an income. So in the non-agricultural season, many workers have to migrate to other urban areas, to the cities in search of work. So very often then migration cycles, and specifically distress migration cycles, are also linked with agricultural cycles, and this migration is circular. So Bremen says that this is largely characterized by nomadic work and life patterns, and migrant labor has remained footloose, leading to their continual circulation rather than permanent outmigration of workers from rural areas. Now, scholars such as Priya Deshankar and John Farrington conceptualize circular migration in two categories. Theirs is a more differentiated understanding of circular migration. One category is scoping migration, where households are able to smooth consumption and manage risk, or accumulative migration, which allows accumulation of assets, savings and investment. And Deshankar and Farrington argue that these are not fixed entities. Scoping migration and accumulative migration need not necessarily be fixed, mutually exclusive entities. Under favorable circumstances such as the availability of more regular work and skill acquisition leading to better wages, scoping migration streams may become more accumulative. Now, David Moss's work shows that we cannot look at labor migration and circulation away from a single model to explore the relationship between structure and agency. So now David Moss's work shows that we need to approach labor migration and circulation in such a way to understand the relationship between structure and agency, urban work and rural society. And so in the context of their work in tribal migration, they hypothesize that migration is a forced livelihood response, and it's a response to a very complex set of social relations such as debt, dependency, or it may provide a positive opportunity for saving, capital accumulation and investment. Now, in the context of their research with seasonal tribal migrants in Western India, where migration is associated with long-term debt, they find that it's often extremely unprofitable and unproductive for migrants themselves, and migration experiences therefore vary widely by the economic resources that a household can command, right? And specifically for seasonal tribal migrants in Western India, migration is associated with debt, dependency, long-term debt. It's often extremely unprofitable and unproductive for tribal migrants. And these migration streams are very precarious, and tribals are adversely incorporated in migration in this context. And what you see is that it is distress migration, it is a forced livelihood response, and if there were opportunities available in the rural context where they live, they would not perhaps migrate for work. Now, what is the impact of circular migration in source areas, right? So, recent research has focused on the impact of circular migration in source regions in the context of rural-urban migration to Bangalore in South India. Jonathan Pattenden and David Picherit's work in the context of rural-urban migration in South India, Jonathan Pattenden's work on migrants in Bangalore and David Picherit's work on migration in Hyderabad, they clearly show signs of upward social and economic mobility among the laboring class migrants. And despite the work being in the urban construction sector, apparently rooted in poverty and exploitation, labor circulation has enabled migrants to decrease their dependence on dominant classes in the rural areas for employment and credit. Similarly, David Picherit's work finds that for seasonal rural urban migrants, aspirations are centered around their lives in the village. So, you have lower caste seasonal migrants that mediate daily wage work in the construction sector to orchestrate their social and political rise, and then in turn they seek advantage in caste politics and development in their home villages. So, therefore, while Pattenden's analysis is around the axis of class, Picherit's work revolves around caste, and both in the context of rural urban migration in South India. So, therefore, it's not surprising to see that the two intersect. And Dalit and Adivasi circular migrants also take back with themselves not just skills in construction and savings, but also cultural icons of emancipation from the city to the village. This is a very, very important point, and you might remember Soundarya Iyer gave a lecture in which she spoke about circular migration and localized urbanization, emphasizing this point. So, therefore, seasonal labour migration, despite it being adverse in very many ways, has also enhanced the ability of subaltern communities to assert themselves against landed farmers. And one critical common finding that runs through these empirical studies is that circular migration has enabled upward mobility for those at the lower rungs of the social and economic hierarchy in the village. Now, these studies draw on labour circulation, but what is common among these is that they associate circular migration with seasonal migration. And so, coming back to this, in the context of Bihar surveys also, Deshankar and Farrington define circular migration as a temporary move followed by return to the normal place of residence for purpose of employment. So, remember, they are saying it is a temporary move. Now, this is what I want to come to, and this is in the context of defining what is migration, what is circular migration, what is long term migration, what is short term migration. Now, what you have in standard surveys, the normal place of residence is where the respondent typically spends a majority of his or her time, right. So, therefore, embedded in this definition is an understanding that the time spent away is less than the time spent in the normal place of residence. Now, interestingly, many studies including in China, including China's National Bureau of Statistics, they use a 6-month cutoff period to define migrant workers. If someone's away for 6 months or more, they're a migrant worker. If they're not away for 6 months or more, then they are not a migrant worker. So, definitions matter, and again, for people who are thinking of doing their own research, conducting their own surveys, or even if you're doing qualitative work, it's very important for you to understand how is it that you conceptualize migration, how is it that you define it, right? So, now let me come to the empirical work that I'm going to be discussing in the context of circular migration. So, let me take you now to the empirics of Bihar migration. This is work that I've been doing for quite some time, and at the Institute for Human Development in New Delhi. So, now these are longitudinal surveys and that have studied the same households in 1999, 2011 and 2016. And so, what we really have is, so you have household surveys, and in 2016, the sample was of 1,588 households and 9,737 individuals. And then there's data on return migrants, 224 return migrants in 2016, which was collected through a return migration module specifically. And then I want to talk a little bit, I will take you through the cases of one village city migration stream from North Bihar to Delhi, and there are 42 key informants. This was conducted in 2014, and I will use family case studies and migrant narratives to discuss the circularity of migration. So, now it is important that we look at the definition of a household that we have used in the study, right. So, definition of the household is a person or a group of persons who live in the same dwelling and eat food from a kitchen. It also includes persons who are away from the village for work or other exigencies but visited the village at least once in the year preceding the survey. So now you can see that this is an extended definition of the household, and this extended definition of the household allows us to include migrants who share household resources when they are in the village and maintain a rural residence otherwise. Now, if we had used the definition of 6 months or 3 months, any of these arbitrary definitions, then we would have lost a lot of people who actually migrate, right, and are part of the household. So, it's really important, at least in the Indian context where migration is circular, that we use an extended definition of a household to understand household members and the remittances and so on. And the India Human Development Survey also uses a similar definition, and this allows us to incorporate migration and remittances in the source area household, right? And this is the source area perspective, that these migrants, even though they are away for long periods of time, but even if they visited once, at least once in the year, we consider them as household members. Right. Now, with that, we find that that migration has been increasing, that the percentage of migrants that are away for more than 8 months in a year increased from 42%, from 42.5% in 1999 to 60.7% in 2011 to 76.7% in 2016. So, in other words, 3/4 of all migrant workers, more than 3/4 of all migrant workers are away for more than 8 months in the village, right? And so, therefore, definitions matter, right? If we don't consider these individuals as household members because they are away for more than 6 months, then we will be unable to get a perspective on these members. Remember, migrants are highly mobile, but the households are immobile, right? So, we have to balance out the highly mobile migrant and the highly immobile household. And if a migrant is away and their parents, their children, the wife, they're all in the village, it is only natural to include them as a part of the household. What we also find is that a majority of migrants, right, a majority of migrants are actually away for more than 10 months in a year, and this is a huge number. Now, as you can see, migration is largely male dominated, and so you have, so as now you can see that migration is largely male dominated. And then if you had to consider households with migrants and the share of remittance income in total income, you can see how households with migrants increased from 45. You can see how households with migrants increased from 45% in 1999 to 62.1% in 2011 to 64.9% in 2016. So, nearly 2 in 3 households have migrant members. And then if you look at the share of remittances, the light blue, you can see that the share of remittances in migrant households or the share of remittances in households with migrants also increased. By the time you come to 2016, more than half of the household income in migrant households in rural Bihar was coming from remittances. So, therefore, it's very important to include these migrants in the household as members of household, and many surveys, however, don't do that. And conventional, rigid house definitions of household and members then will miss out on these important aspects of circular migration if we don't include migrants as household members, right? So, now what I want to do is, I want to take you through a family case study, right? A family case study to show the structural dependence of rural households on urban remittances. So, we will take the case of AD, And so AD is 45 years old. When AD was 12, he left the village in North Bihar for Delhi. Garib the, takleef thi, he says. We were poor and there were problems. And this is why I came to the city. He arrived with an uncle who helped him find work at a radio factory, where he worked for about 5 years, after which he worked at a fan factory, where he continues to work both in the informal sector. AD and his uncle share a small dingy room in a precariously built multi-storied structure with several other migrants from their village. This has been their home in Delhi since AD first came more than 3 decades ago. His wife BD lives in the village with their teenage children, 3 sons and a daughter. BD sells vegetables in the local market and is able to earn about 1500 rupees per month. So remember, this is, just to remind you, this is from 2014. Yet, it is remittances sent by AD from his monthly income of 6 to 8,000 rupees that sustains the rural household. When money comes via remittances every month, I am able to make ends meet, says BD. When there is no remittance, we go to the moneylender. In the past, BD used to work as an agricultural laborer in the village. But now she has stopped working in other people's farms. Unlike her, AD has neither worked in agriculture nor worked in the village. The family is in debt. They borrowed 3 lakhs rupees for their daughter's wedding 3 months ago, apart from another loan of 40,000 rupees that was taken for BD's surgery for the removal of her uterus. The loans were taken from informal sources in the village at an exorbitant rate of 4 to 5% per month. Despite having worked in the city all his life, AD laments, who will give us a loan in Delhi? In Delhi, apart from work, AD does not venture out much from his room. He doesn't feel the need to meet or mingle with anyone other than his fellow villagers with whom he lives. He worries about home. Life is hard. As much as he would like to live in the village, he says that he lives in the city as there is a compulsion to earn. Majboori hai. There is a compulsion to earn. In the village, there is no work, he says wryly. The government has distributed MG Narega cards, but where is the work? All the people are here in Delhi. No one wants to stay there in the village. AD visits the village during the festival time every year. And in times of emergency, when someone is ill, someone has died, or when there's a wedding, he talks to his wife and children 2-3 times in a week. He has a mobile phone and so do they. We are labor folk. If we don't work, what will we eat? I don't earn much. How can I bring them, that is my family, to the city? If I had money, I would have got them. Indeed, 8 years ago, his wife had come to the city to live with him. And she liked it very much. But she returned after a year. She explained, there is no work for me there. We are unable to meet our expenses. AD asked, why should women come here? What will they do here? Referring to the city. Someone is needed in the village. If my wife also comes here, who will take care of the house in the village? There's a clear sense that if he had not left the village, he would have been worse off. I would have been working in someone else's fields as an agricultural laborer, he remarks. But return migration is a compulsion. There is no other way. I will eventually have to go back to the village. AD's father, on the other hand, like his wife BD, had worked as an agricultural laborer in the village. He did not migrate to the city for work, though he had visited Delhi several times. So, what is also then really evident from this is that migrants are deeply aware that they cannot afford to have their families in the city. A 42-year-old peasant migrant told me, if my family came here, I'll be happy, but suffer losses. If my family came here, सुख तो मिलेगा पर नुकसान होगा. I will be happy but suffer losses. How will I support them? You need to earn at least 20,000 rupees per month to support a family here. It is natural to miss your family. But I spend 300 rupees every month to talk to them 2 to 3 times a week. So migrants were deeply aware that they cannot afford to have their families in the city. For them, the city is only the urban sprawl that they live in, congested and cramped. They stayed in constant touch with their families back in the village. And it's this rural-urban circulation and the belief that the circulation will eventually culminate in a final return to the village is what continues to motivate them for work, for monetary gains in exploitative conditions and bear the ignominy that comes with their urban sojourn. Income from migration becomes crucial not just for everyday economic sustenance of families, but also future life cycle events. For instance, when I asked the 42-year-old peasant migrant when he would return to the village for good, he whispers that he can't afford such a luxury. Only when his sons are settled and daughter married can he think about doing something like this. So he says, जब तक लड़की की शादी नहीं कर लेंगे, तब तक परदेश में रहना अनिवार्य है. Until it is necessary to live here, until I marry my daughter off. Now, Cindy Fan's work here becomes really important. Cindy Fan, in the context of China, internal migration, rural-urban migration in China, she finds that circular migration is no longer just a temporary solution, but has become a long-term practice of many rural Chinese, and peasant migrants have developed mobility and social strategies that help them deal with exclusion and discrimination they face in the city. Now, this also needs to be read with the discussion that migrants prefer to live in the village if they had a choice. And one of my research participants explained, when I go to the village, I feel happy. When I come back to the city from the village, my heart weeps. But I have to come back to the city. There is economic compulsion. There is economic compulsion. It is only when we come to the city that we can earn to sustain ourselves and our families. And then most migrants articulated that the village is a better place for their families than the city. The village is safe, the village is home, and the city is the other. The city is what they call pardes. And so this is also the rural pull, of course, along with urban exclusion, is an important part in understanding circular. The rural pull along with the, of course, along with urban exclusion is an important part when we are trying to understand the circularity of rural-urban migration in India. So, as we saw earlier, this migration stream that we have discussed is highly skewed by sex, and its spatiality is mediated by gender. Men migrate to the cities and women stay back in the village. Now, in all of our interviews, migrant men felt that women should not migrate and that they should live in the village. So, one of my research participants said, "Why should women come here?" referring to the city. "What will they do here? Someone is needed in the village. If my wife also comes here, who will take care of the house and other things in the village?" And another participant said, "In our house, women don't work. It's considered bad. Bura mana jata hai. It's not allowed. They're allowed only in schools, banks, and government jobs. That's it." Such attitudes of disdain and disapproval by male migrants towards women who have moved are also noted by other scholars. Now, the strong disinclination of men towards female work and mobility can be located in patriarchal norms, and one of its key ramifications is that the family remains geographically dispersed. So, Aryan Rehan has argued that continuous circular migration is a consequence of rural family strategies, kinship relations, and marriage opportunities that draw labor migration that draw labor migrants back to their communities time and again. Therefore, migration as a strategy can be attributed to not just economic reasons, but also social and cultural reasons, and kinship and family ties in the source areas perpetuate the circularity of migration. Now, you see, ties to the village and city and the inevitability of return are therefore inextricably tied. All migrants are interviewed clearly articulated that they wanted to work in the village, but not in agriculture. If there was a factory in the village, then why should we stay here? Asked one research participant. Now, for migrants, ties to the village were very important, no matter how long they had stayed in Delhi. They constantly affirmed their rural identity. The sight of the city presented them with very diverse and contradictory experiences. It allowed them to see and experience its modernity, its anonymity, yet at the same time, it made them negotiate an urban economic landscape that was precarious, yet one that made possible a higher income and aspirations of a better life for themselves and their families. So therefore, the city for them was only a means of livelihood. What they get from the city is something that goes back to the village. So urban income is only a means to a better rural life and not an end in itself. And it is in this context that, the disassociation and disaffect with the city, that long-term circular migration sustains rural material conditions that have now become structurally dependent on urban remittances. So, how can we bring this all together? Now, when we move towards the conclusion, through this longitudinal study of a stream of internal migration in India, we find that there's been a shift in the pattern of circular migration. Circular migration is not predominantly seasonal, it's not predominantly short term, it's predominantly long-term circularity that we find in the context of rural urban migration. Why is it circular? It's circular because migrants eventually return to the rural destination. So you see how then even in the context of international migration, migration is circular. In the context of internal migration, migration is circular to a large extent, and these dynamics are similar in many ways and different in other ways. The other thing that clearly emerges is that there is a privileging of the economy. In our study of Bihar migration, we find that permanent migration is very, very low. The rate of permanent migration is very low, but only those at the top of the social and economic hierarchy in the village are able to migrate permanently. You have very similar empirics in international migration, right? So, the privilege of permanent migration in international migration is again to a very small section of the population, which is highly educated, which is highly skilled, which not only has economic capital but also social and cultural capital. So again, I would urge you to think about how circularity works in migration and how it is similar for both internal and international migration in so many ways. Now, in the context of India and in the context of internal migration, despite constitutional guarantee of free mobility, exclusion of migrants from the city beyond their working years makes family settlement close to impossible, right? So, the economics of migration play out in such a way that migrants simply cannot afford to live in the city with their families, and nor are they unable to afford long-term settlement. And then therefore, migrant housing is a very important area of policy, and for this, there is a guest lecture by Dr. Mukta Nayak which will be helpful. So, what are the implications then for rural and urban policies, right? So, then therefore, there are tensions in rural development and urban development. and there are tensions of this with urbanization. India, the urbanization rate continues to remain very low. The main reason why it's so low is because of circularity in rural-urban migration. Historically, migration is a fundamental feature of urbanization and development, but because of our low rates of urbanization, located to a great extent in the circularity of migration, we have tensions in our development project, right? So, that's another important reason to better understand the circularity in migration as opposed to conventional, as opposed to the historical development of Western societies where urbanization and economic development and rural-urban migration have gone hand in hand. So with that, we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much. I hope you found this talk on the circularity of migration being a fundamental feature of our rural-urban migration in India and of our development useful. Thank you.